Sego, Skanago Aguego. Thanks, Ian, and the organizers for inviting our sister to welcome us this morning. And just acknowledge on the territory of the Tsleil-Waututh people and appreciated her welcome, and really feel like it was a good way to start off the conference, and sincere as well, as we've been talking about that. So appreciate that. Also appreciate all the speakers that came before me. I was talking in the washroom and in the hallways about how it's been great. I feel like a grad student again, sitting here today, taking notes, literally got about 10 pages of notes on the things people have been talking about. So it's really good to put the work that I'm doing and that we're doing collectively in Indigenous movements, on Indigenous movements and Indigenous sovereignty and nationhood in this larger context. And to have reminders and some new information, but also reminders of how the struggles of all of our peoples are connected and related. And oftentimes, I find my own experiences oftentimes getting put into a blinder mentality and kind of focused on what we're focused on, the issues that we're facing, the challenges that we're facing personally in our communities and so forth, kind of keep us from seeing that. So I really appreciate this opportunity to come and make those connections mentally, but also hopefully politically as well, and can carry on the work that we're doing. So I kind of forgot the title that I listed. I know it is From Red Power to Reconciliation. My talk is going to actually be updated somewhat. So just on the fly here, it's From Red Power to Resurgence. And I'll talk about that, the reason for that, slight modification as I go along. The focus that what I want to focus on is really looking at the evolution of the idea of what it is to be in struggle as an Indigenous person, and limiting it to Canada. I have a lot of friends and connections in other parts of the world, and I think that'll be a good thing to talk about, indigeneity in a global context. I'm going to limit it to the experience here in Canada, and there's some overlap to the United States experience. I think that's a historical fact, but also I think that also because of the relationship of our peoples cross-border culturally and in terms of our identities and so forth, you naturally have to talk a little bit about that. But I'm going to mainly focus on the legal and political context and social context of Canada. What it is to be in struggle, much more so than focus on kind of a detailed chronology of the development of the Indigenous movement, because I think it's really important time right now that we're facing as Indigenous people in terms of defining what it is that we're trying to achieve. We've had really great presentations on visions, utopian visions, socialist visions, and so forth. Indigenous peoples have always related, I think, in the contemporary era to the kind of visions that we're talking about here, the transformational visions of society, especially with socialist visions, anarchist visions, more contemporarily in my own experience. But I'd like to add to the conversation here and add a unique element in outlining the Indigenous vision of what it is to be in struggle, and the Indigenous vision going forward, especially in the linkage that you made right at the end, Ian, in terms of, and it was mentioned by Joan as well, but made explicitly by you at the end, about how these movements have been enriched by engagement with Indigenous communities and Indigenous struggles. Just as an aside, I can remember a time, and I mentioned this increasingly more often as I talk these days, I can remember a time when environmental movements and Indigenous movements were at odds as opposed to being allies. And so in this moment of resistance to Trans Mountain and so forth, and going back beyond that for at least a decade, you go further to that decade, past historically, deeper into history there, and you find not only a lack of connection, but actually some animosity and some conflict there. I was at a talk once in Australia talking about Indigenous ethics in a conference on environmental ethics, and I've told this story once or twice before, so apologies to those of you that may have heard it, but Arne Naas was sitting in the front, and when I mentioned about how Indigenous peoples were at odds with environmental movements because environmental movements didn't take into account Indigenous rights and sovereignty, he literally jumped out of his seat. He literally jumped out of his seat and ran towards me. And you can see me, how I am. And Arne Naas is a force. wasn't for us, but he's only this big. And so he came at me and made the emphatic point, banging on my chest in front of a whole conference. That is not environmentalism. That is not environmentalism. Deep ecologists really know, and I know, and where I come from. And if it's ever going to mean anything, it's going to take into account Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty and so forth. And so right there, I knew we had something. Like we had something to build on. And that was in 1998. And I know that because I was just talking about a book that I'd written that came out in 99. And so from that point, you look at the really strong transformations that have taken place in regard to connections and building a movement. And I think that is evidence of the truth of what you were saying in terms of the transformational potential of all of the movements that we're talking here, on all of the issues that we're talking here, when we really come together and respect the true roots of resistance in this land. And I think it's taken us so long to get there. Everybody's dealt with their own issues. Everybody's had their own concerns. And there's been pressing concerns, war, nuclear threats, and alienation of women and suppression of women's rights and so forth. All of these things these battles have been fought, movements have been organized to fight these battles, but transformation of this country from a colonial imperialist country to one that is good for everyone is going to take the coming together of those movements. And I'll go further than that, the rootedness of those movements going forward in this land through Indigenous philosophies and Indigenous principles of religion, resistance and way of life. That's the commitment that I hold in coming to this work, and it's not the commitment that I always shared. I had a commitment towards nationhood, I had a commitment towards resistance, I had a commitment towards a lot of different things, but just like other people who have come to recognize the power in this kind of coming together and drawing from Indigenous teachings, we have come to recognize the power of our own teachings as we've used them more, as we've learned more from our own, and as we've rerouted more, and also the power of other teachings. And so in tracing this, I'm really tracing a historical trajectory of the development not only of a powerful movement in Canada and its potentiality, but also a coming to realization of Indigenous people of their own power, rooted in our own philosophies and ways of existence. And so starting off and kind of going back in the historical moment, I'm a writer that likes alliteration, so I have my 4 R's, and there's sometimes 2 or 3, but today they're 4. So I have 4 R's: revolution, recognition, reconciliation, and resurgence. So the 4th one just came today. As I say, I can't do my talk and just stop at reconciliation. No, this is a history conference. It's a history environment, but I really have to put out the vision going forward as well. And so, if I have time, hopefully I'll do justice to all of those. So, looking at the Indigenous movement as we kind of conceptualize it today in this kind of coherent thing that we identify as linking Indigenous peoples is in itself a construction. Okay, and it's an aspect of modernity, because previous to, of course, colonization, previous to the contemporary era, the modern era, so to speak, Indigenous peoples were nations in and of themselves. And it's sort of like Aboriginal Issues 101, where people think about Aboriginals or Indigenous people or even Indigenous nationhood. We have to remind people that no, those things are made up of very distinct groups of people. Distinct political, social, cultural entities. And today we can speak about indigeneity because of colonization, because of the fact that we are in resistance to a force which affects us all in relatively the same way. But before that, the Royal Commission did a study, and I remember there being kind of 60 was the approximate number. 50 to 63 distinct groups of people living in the area of what is now Canada that were distinguished by unique languages, cultural practices, historical existence, and land bases, and so forth. So you can think about 60-ish type of nations now referred to as Indigenous peoples, or Aboriginal peoples. And within our community, and anyone who studies these issues knows that those differences haven't gone away. They're still there, and they're still salient features of any kind of discussion of politics or society or culture. But we also have to recognize that there is a commonality of experience and a focus to our purpose. And so over time, the idea of being Indigenous has emerged and it has become real. So another thing of like, oh, I remember when using the word Indigenous in the way that I'm using it was contentious. Again, in the 90s, talking about the concept of indigeneity and so forth, getting shouted down by people of an older generation from Native communities, rightly so, saying, you are attacking our nations by using that. You are undermining our nations by doing that. And that degree of contention still kind of exists there intellectually. Everybody's intention over the value of indigeneity and framing it that way versus rooting yourself in your own nationhood as a Mohawk, as a Gitxsan, as a Tsleil-Waututh, as Coast Salish, and so forth. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm kind of like blowing through that and moving on to a new conception of indigeneity. But my work is very clear, and my perspective is very clear in asserting the fact that there is a consciousness, there is a set of political relationships, and increasingly language, culture, kinship, and all of the makings of an ethnic and national identity that you can identify at one level being Indigenous. And so there's a coming together of people. And so I feel that my identity as an Indigenous person is like of a nested identity. It is in Ganawage, Bear Clan. It is in Buffalo, when I go to the University of Buffalo to a conference on Haudenosaunee Studies, Mohawk. If I go to Trent, I'm a Mohawk, no doubt about it. I'm a Ganawage Mohawk. If I am here, I'm a Mohawk. If I go to Australia and start talking about these issues, I'm a Canadian Indigenous person. I am all of those things, and they are all just as real. And that's something that's really new for our people. And I'm here talking about that level of our nested identity that exists at the level of the commonality of these nationhoods in struggle against colonization. And this really emerged. This is subject to debate too, and there were predecessors to it too, because people from the Haudenosaunee community, Daskahe in the 1920s was a Cayuga chief who went over to the League of Nations and advocated for the recognition of our sovereignty. And there's been activism on the international level, and there's been activism where the struggles of the collectivity of our people have been represented in a unified way previous to the 1960s and 70s. But the 1960s and 70s were really the coming together of a consciousness of indigeneity. And I believe, I'm no expert on Latin America or Australia or New Zealand, but I've traveled in all of these places, and I believe it's the same. And I think that has a lot to do with all of the themes that we're talking about here today. It has to do with decolonization, has to do with radicalization, and it has to do with the remaking of identities on so many different axes. And Indigenous peoples were not unaffected by that. They were not separate from that. They, by that time, were reading papers, watching TV like everyone else, and these things came into their lives. And I was only in kindergarten in 1968, not like Jim, who said he was a little bit in high school or something. So I can't really say, I can't claim from experience to say I've experienced that in the 60s. But certainly by the time I was politically conscious and conscious as a person, which my first political memories are about 1973, there was definitely a consciousness of an, at the time, throwback word, Indian. Okay, there's terminology that is now no longer used anymore, but an indigenous consciousness, certainly by the middle of the 1970s, had come into play. And this is related directly to the influence of Black power in the United States, civil rights movements, but especially the Black power element of the liberation struggle of African Americans, and its direct influence on the development of not only a consciousness, but a strategy and a strategic vision on how to confront oppression in their societies. And it had that element, and it also had the element that was obviously at play as well in the African American struggle, which was the redefinition and the reconceptualization of identity. I don't have to tell too many people here, and I hope I'm not going to spend too much time actually talking about this, but part of the colonization of our peoples was in the creation of that negative self-image. I mean, we're all talking about how colonization is constructed and implemented and maintained. And of course, anybody who reads Fanon and Memi and all the scholars that we're talking about here knows that that negative self-conception is essential and at the foundation of it. It's basic. Indigenous peoples in this country had come to think of themselves in that way. And the breaking of that notion of what it is to be an Indian and the freeing of people to explore and to develop and to recreate themselves in their own languages, using their own culture, on their own land, and so forth, was a significant part of what we call red power in that era. If you go outside the longhouse where one of the activists from the earlier era that I mentioned earlier, Descahe, is buried, his tombstone and what it says on there is very simple in terms of what he was fighting for. What we want is to be able to be free to live by our culture, to worship our gods in our own land. It's I may be paraphrasing, but it's that. It's nothing more than to be ourselves, to be authentic. So the struggle is not only a struggle against empowerment, a power put on top of us, but it's also empowerment of our authentic self. And so this resonates with a lot of the themes in the decolonial literature and the things that people are talking about here. Coming out of that, we had the main thrust of our activism and our politics was the organization of forces in order to confront the mechanics of colonization and the powers that were imposing colonization in our communities most directly. And so warrior societies, the American Indian movement, and so forth, confronted the most present features of colonization. And when I mentioned my own political awakening, 1973, and I know when it is because I can look it up because it's in the newspapers, because I remember in Kahnawake, where I grew up, there were a series of riots that started in 1973 where the Mohawk Warrior Society, which had been influenced by the American Indian movement, not only influenced but trained by and directly took their inspiration from, which directly took their inspiration from Black Power and so forth, came, and so my own family were involved and people throughout the community were involved in this red power sensibility of having to confront not only the idea of what it is to be an Indigenous person, but also begin to confront in revolutionary ways through resistance those forces which were keeping so many of our people back in that colonial mentality and that colonial set of existences. And so band councils were burned, people were evicted, all kinds of tactics and strategies that we're all kind of familiar with in all of these movements all over the world. That was an agenda that was put forward. So I would trace this aspect of the movement, which began in the 60s and continued on through the 70s, as reaching its sort of watershed moment for Canada, in Canada, and its most symbolic representation being the conflict in 1990 between the Mohawk Nation and Quebec and Canada. So if you can trace militant resistance on the part of Indigenous peoples, you have to trace it through the rise of these warrior societies, not only in Mohawks. I'm giving prejudice somewhat to my own experience because that's where I grew up and that's what I remember the most, but Mi'kmaq, Anishinaabe, occupation of parks, all throughout the early 1980s, you had the occupations and land defenses and land-based activism among the Gitxsan and other nations in northern British Columbia, and you had examples of what I'm talking about throughout the country. But I don't think it can be argued that 1990 is not the most representative moment of Indigenous resistance in Canada. Even today, people still talk about it. If you look at how people are motivated and inspired to resist even if you go to, I wasn't there, but if you go to Trans Mountain, I bet you'll see the flag, the Mohawk warrior flag. It's come to symbolize resistance against oppressive measures by the state, resistance to illegal occupation, stolen lands, disregard of treaties, and so forth. And this gets traced all to the resistance of the warrior societies to that most present feature of colonization in an attempt to move that power away. As I move on and talk about another pathway or another element, I'm not saying that this has ended. Okay. Energy shifts, the dominant kind of experience kind of moves over to new opportunities and develops. But even as we speak today, the Manuel sisters, George Manuel's granddaughters, Art Manuel's daughters, they are the ones leading the resistance in Canada, both in terms of ideology and actual on-the-ground action. And this continues. And so there are people still doing it in this way. And the other things that I'm going to talk about, recognition, reconciliation, and resurgence, they might look at differently. I can't speak for them. I have a sense that they would recognize some elements in there as being things that resonate with them, but they are still committed to that resistance mentality and that resistance posture in relation to the Canadian state. And there are many Indigenous peoples who support that as well. After 1990, one of those major shifts started to occur. And it really built on momentum that had developed earlier, at least as early as the 70s, in the mid-70s, in the development of an approach to resolving the disconnection between two ideas in Canada: the continuing existence of Indigenous peoples, the humanity of Indigenous peoples, the fact that Indigenous peoples were here and had nations and culture and rights and so forth, and the idea of the Canadian state and Canadian civilization here in this territory. How do you reconcile that? Previous reconciliations, not in the way we're using it now, but previous reconciliations were move the natives, well, even earlier than that, get rid of the natives, then move the natives, then control the natives. But beginning in the 1970s, starting with the Calder decision and decisions that came from the Supreme Court as a result of Indigenous peoples' challenges in the court realm, you had the idea of recognition. So that's the second R. The Canadian government developed an approach to reconciling the idea of Indigenous sovereignty with Canadian sovereignty that it called recognition. And so I would say that court decisions, ideas about negotiations over self-government, negotiating a place for Indigenous peoples within the governmental structure of Canada, the idea of modern treaties like in British Columbia and the Nisga'a Treaty being emblematic of that, all reflect a shift from on-the-ground resistance and political resistance to activism within the legal realm, so legal activism. And so starting in the 1970s and especially into the 1980s and into the 1990s, you have legal activism. And the government's response to that is to create a framework for recognizing Aboriginal rights. Because of course in 1982, with the repatriation of the Constitution, you have a situation where for the first time, reluctantly, in Canadian law, in the highest law of the land, there is a recognition of the idea of Aboriginal rights and title to the land. I've spent so many talks and written so many pages criticizing the doctrine of Aboriginal rights and title, and so I'll just boil down my critique into a 1-minute version, which is that, and I believe this reflects the consensus among Indigenous peoples who are active politically and who are organized around this identity of indigeneity, which is that the doctrine of Aboriginal rights and title does not allow for the full exercise of Indigenous nationhood and culture, in the sense that it recognizes Indigenous sovereignty, it recognizes Indigenous existences, it recognizes Indigenous cultural practice and so forth, only to the extent that they don't fundamentally contradict core Canadian values. And of course, most Canadians support this and accept that notion. But from an Indigenous perspective, especially someone who is coming from an era of resistance where the idea is to preserve your land, preserve your cultural practice, restore your nationhood, and get control over your territory and future, the idea that you're going to get recognized to the extent that it doesn't contradict the ongoing colonial project is a bit disappointing. And so my critique is always centered on, and I'm not a legal scholar, I should say, although I have spoken at UVic Law once or twice, and I would say that boils down to what we're going to see coming forward. Here's a bold prediction on my part from the Supreme Court over the Trans Mountain issue, which is that Aboriginal rights and title may be infringed even when they're proven to exist in the interest of the national economy and the society as a whole. It says that right in the major decision, which is emblematic of the recognition framework, which is the Delgamuukw decision, and has been implemented many times and brought forward many times in legal reasoning on other cases. And so that's the, what is it, an Achilles heel or a fatal flaw or something in the doctrine of Aboriginal rights and title, is that you essentially have a stalling tactic that you can use. You essentially have a tactic that where if you want to, you can spend years and millions of dollars delaying the inevitable, in the hopes that politics shifts, economy changes, and so forth, to make these things undesirable going forward. But as an Indigenous nationhood principle, the idea of Aboriginal rights and title is severely limited. But that has been the thrust of our movement since at least the 1980s and into the 1990s, and it continues. So just like with the other one, where you have the Manuel sisters who are still fighting hard on the ground, we have an industry, we have a whole structure. Actually, there were some people meeting in the room just outside the washrooms over here, I noticed today, talking about recognizing Aboriginal government's right for taxation and so forth. And so this is a project that's ongoing too, just like these others. And I think that this one is probably the one where you would, if you had to point to something in Canada today where you could say that's where the bulk of activity takes place in regard to the relationship between the Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state, you would point to that whole complex of negotiating self-government agreements and so forth, and taxation agreements, and basically taking the colonial structure and trying to reform it in a way that is minimally acceptable to the bulk of Aboriginal people. And it's a huge project that's ongoing. So that's recognition. Then we have reconciliation, which emerged out of recognition. I would trace the origins of the reconciliation discourse, and there are people who are doing this less on the fly and impressionistic than I. I believe Audra Simpson, a Mohawk scholar, her next book is going to be on reconciliation and tracing the origins of it and critiquing it, so that's one to look for. But as far as I know, and having lived through this, the politics of this, and having worked at the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, I would trace the discourse emergent out of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which was in place from 1992 to 1996, and was a large-scale rethinking of policy and law and history, and offered a incredibly complex set of recommendations for Canadian society to rethink the relationship. I think the idea that reconciliation meant not reconciling the existence of the nations of people that were here and the nation of Canada, that it didn't mean that, but reconciliation meant reconciling with the citizens of Canada who had been harmed by policies and programs of the Canadian state in the past, emerged out of that dialogue and that discourse. And it was hard to identify at first because we were immersed in it and we were talking about so many different things. But I think that when you see the RCAP, you have a historical perspective. You see RCAP, you see the Residential School Settlement Agreement, you see the apology from Prime Minister Harper, and then you see the TRC and the report of the TRC. You see a kind of honing of that perspective that colonialism's injustice was an injustice done to people, not peoples. And key difference in legal language and political language. People are individuals. Peoples are collectivities. And I only learned this lesson because it got, again, people, I don't know, people feel like they can come up to me and grab me and do that kind of stuff. But I was at the UN and I used the word people. And I was like, Indigenous people making a statement on behalf of the Haudenosaunee and so forth. And one of the Cree lawyers there, after in the break, said the same thing. Don't say people. It's peoples. And why? What are you talking about? And obviously it was impressed upon me, because I'm still talking about it today, that collectivities are what we're talking about. That it's not enough to address the harm to individuals. Of course, those harms need to be addressed. And so just as it resulted from this kind of discourse on what is harm, and framing it in terms of a political perspective on the individual citizen's harm and what was done to individual citizens, it also resulted, and I have to say, from the activism of individuals who had been harmed. You know, there were people who had been harmed in residential school, who bore that shame for so many years, and who had the courage to stand up at the Alberni Residential School and all over Canada, and to say, this is what the true history of Canada is. This is what we've endured. And so that kind of psychological aspect of it was important in reconciliation too. And that's why I will never stand up and criticize reconciliation with a broad slate. I say reconciliation is absolutely necessary because of the harm done to people. But reconciliation needs to be more than that. Reconciliation needs to be more than a process to provide restitution for those people that suffered sexual and other forms of abuse from priests and nuns at residential school. It's also the loss of language. It's also the loss of culture. It's also multi-generational in its effect. It was also part of a large-scale process to remove the original inhabitants from territories so that capitalism could come in and continue to exploit that. If you don't talk about those things, then it's not reconciliation. I've written an article on this. It's recolonization. So for a few years, I was very angry about this. And I would, reconciliation's a sellout, reconciliation this, reconciliation that. But in dialoguing, and this is the currency of reconciliation really, dialogue. But in taking it seriously, in dialoguing with people in Canada, I come to understand that there is still potential moving forward, even in the concept of reconciliation, because most people misunderstand. There's very few people for whom it's an agenda to limit, right? So if it's an agenda to limit justice for Indigenous peoples, of course it's wrong. And I think there are a few people for whom it's an agenda. Powerful people benefiting from the land, usually ensconced in government or corporate positions. But for a lot of people, it's just a mistake in understanding. So if it's a mistake, we can continue to engage, we can educate, we can dialogue, and we can enhance people's understanding and expand the notion of what reconciliation is. If it's an agenda, then we defer to our other strategies of resistance and so forth. And so it's not an either or here as well. So for an Indigenous activist and a person envisioning Indigenous resistance, we have to have a multiplicity of approaches, because there's no monolith, as I've come to learn out there. I was joking this morning, it's like, well, I used to think it was like all white people. You know, as a Mohawk growing up, you're like, white people, and that's it. And of course I've learned in the job that I do and the circles that I travel and the friendships that I have and the political activism that I've engaged in, that there is no monolith. And so in outlining these three and looking at the fundamental critique of the current framework of reconciliation, hopefully, and putting this vision forward, hopefully Indigenous activists going into the future can be more effective in understanding in particular locations, times, on particular issues, with particular segments of a society, what posture do I take? how do I relate to them? How am I most effective? Because it is an issue of justice, but it's also an issue of survival. It's not only an issue of doing what's right. It's how do we survive? Because Indigenous peoples, more than any other in this land, are affected in a fundamental way such that not only are the individual survival affected in so many ways, but profoundly, the existence of our culture and our nations and our languages is threatened and continues to be threatened. And we have to acknowledge that. And so in envisioning a future beyond these, it's really incumbent on the thinker and the activist to put that profundity right at the core. It's not enough to just think about these things as a matter of justice. This is the survival of the coming generations, and this was always impressed upon us. This is the survival of the coming generations. If we don't figure out a way to defeat colonization, to address the injustices, there won't be no Mohawk Nation. It's not a matter of the quality of existence of the Mohawks. There won't be any. And there won't be any Gitxsan. And there won't be any Mi'kmaq. So that's a kind of qualitative difference, I think, between a lot of the struggles that we have here. And I think that if people recognize that aspect of it and take that on, especially in relation to environmental concerns and the idea of the planet and its ability to sustain us, if we put that survivance principle into our movements, we'll have a lot more ability to draw a lot more people to a lot more effective action. One way that we've tried to do that is to reframe all of these things into a new conception of what it is to be in struggle. And here's where the resurgence comes in, the resurgence aspect. And this is a relatively new concept that I've been involved in developing along with a lot of other people in this kind of dialogue that's emerged out of these other three experiences. So we've all been involved in resistance, we've all been involved in governmental and legal activism, we've all been involved in trying to do our best in the reconciliation framework. And Joan mentioned Idle No More. And to me, just like Oka's emblematic of the revolutionary strategy and the Delgamuukw decision is recognition and the TRC report is reconciliation, well, Idle No More is really the moment of resurgence so far. Because what it did is really show for this generation of activists and this generation of thinkers, both the potential of an idea called resurgence and the limits of it. And so it really pointed out how powerful we are, but yet what the obstacles are to continuing empowerment and making transformational change. And so it was a challenge, but it didn't transform the system in the way that we had hoped it did. And so when I talk about resurgence, I'm talking about a present, but I'm also talking about a future vision because it is just developing. So the element of a resurgence, to distinguish it from these other aspects as opposed to focusing on dialogue and creating a good relationship between Native people and Canadian society, or reconciling the legal inconsistencies between Indigenous sovereignty and so forth, or confronting obvious injustices, oppressions and so forth, is really how do we reroute ourselves in our existence as Indigenous peoples so that we can regain our authenticity and live lives and pass that legacy on to the next generation. And so for me, it harkens back to an old revolutionary red power type of spirit. It's like we're getting it right, or we're doing it more right now than they did back in the 1960s and 70s, which isn't to say we're doing it all right, but we're getting it better. And I think that the first talk, I think it was, I'm trying to remember, I heard so much good things, but Brian, when we talk about not being afraid to make mistakes, be bold, take chances, learn as you go, those sorts of things in a movement, that's important here. And I think that that's how we can kind of talk about what Indigenous resurgence is now, is because we've tried and we've made mistakes and we've learned. And so when we talk about what resurgence is right now, we're really talking about a reframing of a pathway for people to recover that Indigenous authenticity and then to act on it. And the elements of it, to be brief since I'm running out of my time here, it's community-based. So much more so than involving legal struggles or legal challenges, and much more so than occupying the offices of the BC Treaty Commission or anything like that. It's rerouting yourself in your own community, and that's where the activism is taking place, either at the community level or the family level. And even now, in response to more recent critiques, at the relationship and personal level. So it's taken the idea of decolonization, and this is really building off Indigenous feminist critiques and queer theory and so forth, to kind of move the idea of what it is to be in struggle down to the root and the most intimate connections of colonialism to ourselves. And it's a challenging and exciting time in this, because it forces us to examine our very insides. It's easy to be revolutionary when you're looking outside, very difficult to be revolutionary emotionally when you're looking in the mirror. And so this is the moment we're in. It's land-centered. So it's really about land and water, and here's where the connection to the environmental movement comes in Canada too. So it's not about gaining governmental power. It's not about retaking the Indian Act structures and making them our own, as we had previously envisioned in the past. It's about creating a healthy environment, protecting the waters, and this is so profoundly Indigenous, which is a new thing in our movement, which is that it's looking at all our relations, as that phrase said, in a serious way. If we look at our conception of who we are as Indigenous people, there's no distinction between human beings and other elements of the natural world. The animals, the waters, the land, the bugs, the trees, we are all part of this web, and David Suzuki's written about it in his way, you know, the sacred web, and he's had these dialogues and so forth. It's true. There is a web of relationships that, from an Indigenous sensibility, place you in no hierarchical position relative to anything else. So you have a responsibility to do now, as an Indigenous person, with the power that you have and the skills that you have, to do what those things did for our people for thousands of years. We were naked and vulnerable, and they provided us life with their own bodies and everything that they gave us. Now they're under threat. What's our responsibility? That's what we have to ask ourselves. And that's the thing that Indigenous Resurgence does in taking Indigenous teachings, putting them through a contemporary intelligence and applying them again. It's transformational, the third aspect of it. That's what I meant when I say it's family-centered, it's community-centered, it's relationship-centered, but not just centered there, but oriented towards transformation of those relationships to reflect what anybody here, I think, would agree are terms of justice. But beyond that, Indigenous values, an Indigenous sense of what goodness is in terms of a relationship and the way people experience life. And as I mentioned, that's probably the most difficult journey for a lot of us, because the impacts of colonization have been so profound. And then it's decolonizing as well. So it doesn't let go of the spirit of resistance. It does these things, it roots ourselves in this way of struggle. And the difference between that resurgence attitude and, say, a resistance approach is it doesn't seek to cause confrontation. What it does is it roots itself in a place. It lives indigenously, and it defends itself from intrusions. So that's where the decolonization comes in. It's a matter of focus. Do we structure a movement to go and confront, or do we do our indigeneity in our land as we have the right to do and pass on to our future generations and resist when people come to try to stop that? So it's a subtle shift, but I think a very important one, because it puts the priority on reclaiming, renaming, and re-presencing ourselves in our own land according to our own teachings. And I think Idle No More was a strong reflection of that. But even in the time period between 2013 and 2018, it's already been 5 years. It'll be 5 years coming up. It's very different, and I think much stronger. You have a much stronger rootedness of this idea of reclaiming our own existence and redefining our own existence as Indigenous people, and standing on that and developing political associations, relationships, movements, strategies, and tactics to make that real and to have other people respect that. So to stand on our own authentic indigeneity and to demand respect is really what Indigenous resurgence is all about. And I think that it's a powerful movement in its potentiality, and I'm thoroughly invested in it in all of these levels. And I think that the more that people inside Indigenous communities and outside of Indigenous communities who have a concern with justice know about it, the more they're drawn to it. Because I don't think that Indigenous peoples are the only ones who see limitations to reconciliation, recognition, and obviously resistance as well. So I think that we have a really strong basis for moving together and working together to defeat those forces. And I'll look forward to the dialogue and continuing conversation, and hopefully work in the political realm on the ground with anybody who's concerned with these issues as well. So, Nyawagoa, Donington.